The Sigma 18-35 is without a doubt the tech YouTuber lens of choice, and ultimately one of the most highly recommended lenses within YouTube filmmaking circles. Its constant f1.8 aperture, very useful focal range, and allegedly razor-sharp image quality, all at a somewhat reasonable price, certainly make the lens an intriguing option. This lens developed nothing short of a cult following after Sigma changed the industry by releasing the first f1.8 constant aperture zoom lens. Nearly 6 years have passed since the lens's initial release, and one can't help but wonder if the Sigma remains, or ever really was, the jack of all trades it's been made out to be for what feels like ages now. So, what really causes this lens to stand out? And more importantly, does the Sigma 18-35 actually live up to the hype? We shoot Canon here on this channel, and therefore chose the EF mount version of the lens to pair with the Canon 80D and Ronin S gimbal. The lens is pretty, and when paired with an APS-C camera, adds a noticeable degree of professionalism to the setup thanks to its robust design. The first thing you notice picking up the lens is its noticeable weight. Sigma opted to make this lens heavy, really heavy. This leads to the lens having quite a sturdy, premium feel, but simultaneously makes the experience of filming with a DSLR or mirrorless camera heavier than you might be used to. I personally think the lens is a bit heavier than it needs to be, and considering that it doesn't have image stabilization, I believe it could be lighter. You could argue that this is expected for a high-quality lens, and is part of the trade-off you make when opting for a zoom lens over a prime, but I think the lens is a bit too heavy for what you're getting. Focusing and zooming are both handled internally, which leads to no movement in the lens during zooms, and no breathing while focusing. If Sigma were to create a second-generation version of the lens that included a toggle for image stabilization, but stayed at the same size and weight, I would be content. On that note, the lack of image stabilization is something to seriously consider if you're planning to use this lens for video. I've attached a couple of examples here of what happened when I tried to use this lens handheld, and the horrible micro jitters were enough to keep me from ever recommending this lens for handheld use. For whatever reason, many others have said that because of how wide angle of a lens this is, IS isn't needed, but based on the testing we did here, nothing could be further from the truth. We recommend putting this thing on a tripod or gimbal if your goal is to get usable footage. However, if you use a lens with sensor image stabilization like the GH5, this really shouldn't be much of an issue. When put on a gimbal, the quality of the footage improves dramatically, especially in slow motion. We usually shoot with the Canon 18-135 lens, with stabilization turned on. Gimbal footage from the Sigma is a bit less stable when compared to the Canon setup, but the difference is not super noticeable, especially when set at 18mm and or using slow motion like we generally do. Autofocus performance is noticeably worse when compared to our native Canon setup, especially when shooting all the way open at f1.8. I think this is forgivable considering the lens's age, but is something you should keep in mind if you shoot primarily with autofocus like we do. In some of these examples you can see the lens hunting, and just generally having a hard time keeping up with its subject at higher apertures. Something that creates a problem for those of you running one-man operations looking for a lens that you can rely on in auto. This autofocus issue can't be entirely excused by the lens's wide aperture, as the Canon 50mm 1.8, a lens around a fifth of the price, runs into very little issues in similar environments. Canon's STM technology leads to a very quiet lens in video that avoids hunting even at lower f-stops. To add insult to injury, the Sigma lens makes some noticeable noise when focusing, and while it may not be the worst offender in this area, this noise is still surprising to me given how often this lens is recommended. When it comes to usability, this lens is somewhat desperately in need of a refresh. At this point, you might be starting to wonder why this lens is so often recommended. After all, with downright bad autofocus, no image stabilization, and a considerable amount of heft all working against it, it's almost hard to imagine any good reason to buy this thing. That is where image quality comes into play. The lens captures sharpness and renders colors in a way generally expected of prime lenses. In fact, Its constant f1.8 aperture means the lens effectively serves as a small set of primes. Photos and videos from the lens were nothing short of amazing, and its wide-angle bokeh effect is quite unique and is likely the main selling point for a number of customers. Its 9-rounded blade bokeh design leads to a very pleasing, smooth background blur. Wide angle has become more and more popular in recent years, and while I personally prefer the telephoto look myself, this lens certainly proved to me that wide angle can look quite nice. The clinically sharp nature of this lens means it will pick up every detail in frame, which in and of itself is a double-edged sword. Using this lens at 18mm, I would argue is not the most flattering look for faces. I generally prefer the more compressed look of human faces you get from more telephoto lenses, which strikes me as considerably more flattering. Additionally, softer lenses like the 18-135 capture less of the imperfections of a subject, leading to an even more flattering look of the face. As far as sharpness is concerned, the Sigma performs admirably, and for situations where detail is the main concern, will always be one of the best options. Something to consider though, is that if your main use case is shooting people, particularly faces in their natural element, the Sigma will reveal everything, which isn't always what you want. If precise sharpness, wide-angle bokeh, and low f-stop are what you're looking for, the Sigma will not disappoint. The question remains, should you buy this lens in 2019? I think that question comes down to what your needs actually are. If you're a photographer looking for a great lens you can simply keep on your APS-C camera that provides you all the sharpness and aperture performance of a set of primes, then absolutely yes. If you're a filmmaker who doesn't rely on autofocus and wants to keep your setup mostly on a rig, then yes, this lens will be a great option in the sub-$1,000 range. However, if you're operating a YouTube channel alone and need reliable autofocus, shoot primarily on a gimbal and don't have the budget to hire a focus puller, need a lens you can run and gun with handheld without any sort of rig, then this probably is not the lens for you. My hope is that Sigma will release a second-generation version with image stabilization and considerably faster autofocus so it can actually fill the niche of YouTuber lens. With these issues addressed, it would be an unbeatable lens. The fact is, here on Erickson Films, we'll be sticking with our lower-end Canon lenses for the time being, and continue the search for a relatively affordable lens to eventually replace the Canon 18-135. As it stands, the Sigma 18-35 is an outstanding lens, just one that is starting to seriously show its age. If you're interested in purchasing this lens, or any of the lenses discussed in this video, please use the affiliate links in the description. Shout out to Anson Tan for filming this video and helping me gain a better perspective on this lens. If you'd like to chat with us, join our Discord link in the description, and consider donating to our Patreon. Link is also down there. Until next time.